It was one of those mornings where the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension, the kind that always hum in the air before a judge walked in. The wood-paneled walls seemed to trap the weight of countless stories of justice, redemption, and sometimes pure misunderstanding. On this particular day, Judge Walter Brayson, a seasoned man with a sharp gaze and a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, was running a little behind. The crowd shuffled nervously in their seats, papers rustling as attorneys whispered last-minute advice to their clients. When the heavy oak doors finally creaked open, Judge Grayson entered, adjusting his black robe with a practiced motion. His stern expression immediately commanded respect, but it was his unspoken authority that seemed to quiet the room entirely. He glanced over the docket, a long list of minor infractions, unpaid fines, and disputes that would likely end in quick judgments. To him, this was routine. Another day, another procession of faces he would forget by evening. Among the people waiting was Angela Carter, seated quietly on one of the courtroom's worn benches. Dressed in a simple yet elegant blouse and slacks, she radiated a calm confidence that seemed out of place here. Her long hair framed her face, and her sharp, attentive eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. Angela wasn't nervous, at least not outwardly, but she couldn't help feeling a pang of frustration. She had spent years building her reputation, climbing the ladder in a world where people like her were often underestimated. And yet, here she was, waiting to be judged for something she thought would be dismissed in an instant. Angela's presence didn't go unnoticed. A few people exchanged glances, perhaps puzzled by the quiet poise she carried into this setting. The man seated beside her, wearing a hoodie and jeans, whispered under his breath, "First time in court. You look too put together for this mess." Angela smiled politely but didn't answer. It wasn't the time to explain that her appearance here was a mere blip in her otherwise structured life. A parking ticket that had spiraled into a court summons thanks to an error in her registration, a mistake she had tried to resolve before it got this far. Now she'd found herself facing the very system she had spent years trying to navigate from a completely different angle. When her name was finally called, Angela stood and walked confidently to the front. Judge Grayson glanced up, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than it had on the others. He flipped through the paperwork in front of him, noting the details of her case: unpaid fines, registration issues, late fees that had compounded over time. To him, it looked like a typical case of negligence, someone who had ignored their responsibilities until it caught up with them. "Angela Carter," he began, his voice firm, but devoid of malice. "You stand before this court charged with failure to pay fines and failure to properly register your vehicle. Do you understand these charges?" "Yes, Your Honor," Angela replied, her tone steady. Judge Grayson set the papers down and leaned back slightly, observing her. "Do you have anything to say in your defense before I render judgment?" Angela opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, he raised a hand, cutting her off. "Let me guess," he said, his voice carrying a faint edge of skepticism. "You forgot, or maybe you didn't have time. Everyone has an excuse. What's yours?" The words hung in the air, and Angela felt a flicker of irritation. She had heard this term before, the thinly veiled assumption that people like her, who looked a certain way or came from certain neighborhoods, were always making excuses. But instead of reacting, she took a deep breath and chose her words carefully. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I did not neglect my responsibilities. There was a clerical error with my vehicle's registration that caused the fines to escalate. I tried to resolve it multiple times, but was met with delays and mistakes from the DMV. This is not an excuse, it's a fact." Judge Grayson arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And yet, here we are," he said flatly. "The law is the law, Ms. Carter. Regardless of the circumstances, you failed to address the issue in a timely manner." Angela held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'm here because the system failed me, not the other way around." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line, his annoyance palpable. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he had already judged in his mind as careless. Miss Carter, he said, his tone growing colder, this is not a debate. You've wasted enough of this court's time. I'm imposing a fine off. But before he could finish, something caught his eye. Angela had reached into her bag and placed a neatly organized folder on the table in front of her. She opened it with precision, revealing a stack of documents that were tabbed and highlighted. Your Honor, she interrupted, her voice still composed, if you'll allow me, I have the complete documentation here, including correspondence with the DMV, proof of payment attempts, and email exchanges that show their acknowledgement of the error. I believe you'll find that my case is anything but routine. The courtroom fell silent. Even Judge Grayson seemed momentarily taken aback. He leaned forward, his expression shifting from irritation to curiosity as he scanned the neatly presented evidence. Angela stood tall, her confidence unwavering. She wasn't here to beg for leniency. She was here to assert the truth. But Judge Grayson wasn't ready to concede. He adjusted his glasses and flipped through the papers, his expression unreadable. These are interesting documents, Miss Carter, he said slowly, but they don't erase the fact that you're standing in my courtroom today. The law is still the law. Angela's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. With respect, Your Honor, the law should also serve justice, not just procedure. The judge's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the two locked in a silent battle of wills. Around them, the spectators watched, their interest piqued. Who was this woman, and why did she seem so determined to challenge the very foundation of the system she stood before? Just as Judge Grayson seemed ready to dismiss her again, his gaze drifted to the top of one of the documents. His expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he quickly masked it. He looked back at Angela, this time with a hint of suspicion. Miss Carter, he said, his tone measured, what is your occupation? Angela hesitated, sensing the change in his demeanor. I'm a corporate executive, she replied simply. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he seemed to see her not as just another case on his docket, but as someone who didn't fit the mold he had unconsciously placed her in. The courtroom held its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. But instead of responding, Judge Grayson closed the folder and folded his hands, his eyes fixed on Angela. There was a pause, heavy and deliberate, as if he were recalibrating his entire approach. Well, Miss Carter, he said finally, his voice slower now, it seems there's more to this story than meets the eye. Angela met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. The room buzzed with unspoken questions, the tension building with each passing second. What would Judge Grayson decide? And how far was Angela willing to go to defend her name and her principles? The answer, it seemed, would have to wait. Angela could feel the weight of the judge's stare, but she refused to let it shake her resolve. She had worked too hard, faced too many silent battles, and endured countless assumptions to crumble now. The courtroom was quiet except for the faint scratching of pens on paper as the clerks took notes. She could sense the curiosity in the room growing, the unspoken question on everyone's mind. Asterisk, who is she, really asterisk? Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses again, a habit he seemed to fall back on when processing something unexpected. Miss Carter, he said after a moment, his voice even but with an undertone of intrigue. Tell me, what exactly does a corporate executive like yourself do that leaves you with unpaid fines and unresolved issues? Angela straightened her posture, clasping her hands in front of her. She could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on her. She spoke with the same measured confidence she used in boardrooms filled with skeptical investors. Your Honor, I oversee operations for a global tech firm. My role involves managing large teams, complex budgets, and strategic decisions that affect thousands of employees. My days are long, and my responsibilities are significant. While I take full accountability for addressing the issue sooner, I can assure you my oversight was not a matter of negligence, but rather an unfortunate consequence of miscommunication. Her words were deliberate, each one chosen to convey not just her position, but the reality of her life. A life where every minute was accounted for, where mistakes, even minor ones, could snowball into something like this. Judge Grayson leaned back, His fingers steepled as he considered her explanation. The faintest flicker of a smirk crossed his face, though whether it was out of amusement or skepticism, Angela couldn't tell. "Quite a resume," he said finally. "And yet, you're here, standing before this court like anyone else who has failed to handle their responsibilities." The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they echoed a sentiment Angela had faced countless times in her career. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how high she climbed, she was often reduced to assumptions. She knew the judge wasn't interested in the countless late nights, the missed family gatherings, or the sacrifices she'd made to get to where she was. To him, she was just another case, another name on a long list. But Angela wasn't about to let this moment define her. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice firm but respectful, "I'm not here to ask for special treatment. I'm here because I believe in accountability on all sides. If I failed to resolve this issue sooner, that's on me. But if the system failed to address my concerns and escalated the problem unnecessarily, that's a broader issue that deserves attention." The room seemed to hold its breath again. This wasn't the kind of response Judge Grayson was accustomed to. Most defendants either pleaded for mercy or accepted their fate quietly. Angela, however, was challenging the very premise of the situation, not with anger or defiance, but with logic and poise. "Miss Carter," the judge said, his tone softer but still cautious, "you're suggesting the system is at fault. That's a serious claim. Do you have evidence to support this?" Angela gestured to the folder on the table. "Your Honor, the documents I provided include multiple instances where the DMV acknowledged their error but failed to correct it. I've highlighted the dates and responses for your review. I'm not here to argue against the law. I'm here to demonstrate that I made every reasonable effort to comply with it." Judge Grayson nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the room as if weighing the impact of her words on the gathered audience. He could see the murmurs of agreement, the subtle nods from those who had experienced their own frustrations with bureaucratic systems. For the first time, he seemed to realize that this case was more than just a minor infraction. It was a mirror reflecting deeper issues within the system he upheld. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of challenge, "you've presented yourself well, and your documentation appears thorough. But I have to wonder, why go to such lengths for what is, at the end of the day, a minor fine? Most people would pay it and move on. What makes this so important to you?" Angela took a moment before answering, her gaze unwavering. "Your Honor, it's not about the fine. It's about the principle. If we let errors go unchecked, if we accept inefficiency and mismanagement as the norm, then we're complicit in a system that fails the very people it's meant to serve. I've spent my entire career fighting to prove myself in spaces where I wasn't expected to succeed. This is just another version of that fight." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. Judge Grayson studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be grappling with something. Perhaps his own assumptions, perhaps the realization that this case wasn't as simple as it had first appeared. But Angela wasn't done. She could feel the momentum shifting, the room leaning into her story. "And if I may, Your Honor," she continued, her voice steady, "this isn't just about me. For every person like me who has the resources and the knowledge to fight back, there are countless others who don't. They're the ones who end up buried under fines they don't deserve, caught in a system that doesn't always work the way it should. If my case can shed light on that, then maybe this moment can mean something more." Her words hung in the air, a quiet challenge to the judge, to the court, to the system itself. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. It was clear he hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her. He glanced down at the documents again, his fingers tracing the edges of the folder, as if trying to decide what to do next. "Miss Carter," he said finally, his voice slower now, "you've given me a lot to consider. But this court operates on facts and laws, not on principles alone. I'll need to review your documentation more thoroughly before making a ruling." Angela nodded, her expression calm but determined. "Thank you, Your Honor. That's all I ask." Judge Grayson motioned to the bailiff to collect the folder, his gaze lingering on Angela for a moment longer. There was something in his eyes now. Respect, perhaps, or curiosity. Whatever it was, it marked a shift in the dynamic between them. As Angela returned to her seat, she felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She had said her piece, laid her case bare. Now it was out of her hands. But even as she sat down, she could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, a mix of admiration, skepticism, and perhaps even hope. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Court is adjourned for recess. We'll reconvene this afternoon. As people began to file out, Angela remained seated, her mind racing. She knew this was far from over. If anything, the real fight was just beginning. Angela remained in her seat long after the courtroom began to empty. She watched as lawyers, defendants, and spectators filed out, their voices blending into a low hum of chatter that echoed against the high ceilings. Her thoughts raced, replaying the moments that had just unfolded. She had done what she could, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead gnawed her. This wasn't just about a fine or a courtroom appearance. It was about everything she'd stood for her entire life. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Angela glanced up to see a man in a navy suit approaching her. His briefcase swung lightly at his side, and a knowing smile played on his face. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice smooth and professional, "I couldn't help but admire the way you handled yourself back there. Impressive, to say the least." Angela raised an eyebrow, her guard immediately going up. She wasn't in the mood for small talk, especially not from someone who clearly wasn't here by coincidence. "And you are?" she asked, her tone polite but cautious. "Daniel Hayes," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm an attorney. I wasn't involved in your case, but I've seen enough courtrooms to recognize when someone turns the tables. You have a way with words." Angela hesitated before shaking his hand. "Thanks," she said simply, not entirely sure where this was going. "I couldn't help but notice something about your case," Daniel continued, lowering his voice slightly. "Your argument about systemic inefficiency, it's not just compelling, it's accurate. I've been handling cases like yours for years, and I've seen how these so-called minor infractions can spiral out of control, especially for people without your resources." Angela tilted her head, studying him. She wasn't sure if this was a genuine interest in justice or a lawyer looking to add a high-profile case to his resume. Either way, she didn't want to dismiss him outright. "And what's your angle, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, cutting to the point. Daniel chuckled softly. "No angle," he said, "just an offer. If you want someone to look deeper into how this happened, how the system failed you, I'd be happy to help. Pro bono." Angela's instincts told her to be cautious, but she also recognized an opportunity when she saw one. "I appreciate the offer," she said, her tone neutral, "but I'll need to think about it." "Of course," Daniel replied, slipping a business card into her hand. "Take your time. Cases like yours have a way of uncovering things people don't want uncovered. Just remember, you don't have to fight this alone." With that, he gave her a small nod and walked away, leaving Angela alone with her thoughts once again. She glanced down at the card, her fingers tracing the embossed letters of his name and contact information. There was something about his words that stuck with her, a quiet warning she couldn't ignore. The afternoon session began much the same way the morning had ended. Judge Grayson returned, his expression unreadable, and the courtroom settled into a tense silence. Angela sat quietly, waiting for her case to be called again, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about what Daniel had said, or the way Judge Grayson had looked at her after reading through her documents. There was more going on here, she was sure of it. When her name was called again, Angela rose and walked to the front, her confidence unwavering. This time, however, she noticed something different. The judge seemed more measured, almost hesitant, as he addressed her. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone even, "I've reviewed your documentation, and while it does raise some valid points, it also raises questions about how such a situation could escalate to this level." Angela nodded, her expression calm. I understand, Your Honor. That's why I'm here, to ensure those questions are answered. Judge Grayson leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him. I've also taken the liberty of requesting additional information from the DMV regarding your case. What I found was concerning. The room seemed to hold its breath. Angela's pulse quickened, but she maintained her composure. Concerning in what way, Your Honor? The judge hesitated, choosing his words carefully. It appears there were irregularities in how your case was handled. Files were misplaced, fines were incorrectly calculated, and at least one correspondence was marked as resolved when it clearly was not. This isn't standard incompetence. It suggests a deeper issue within the system. Angela felt a mix of vindication and unease. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was both satisfying and unsettling. Does this mean the case will be dismissed? She asked, though she already knew the answer wouldn't be that simple. Judge Grayson shook his head. Not yet, Miss Carter. While the errors are clear, they don't negate the fact that you still owe the original fine. However, I'm ordering an internal review of the DMV's handling of your case. Depending on what they find, there may be broader implications. Angela nodded, her mind racing. This was progress, but it also meant the spotlight on her case was about to grow brighter. And with that came risks, both personal and professional. She thought back to Daniel's words. Asterisk cases like yours have a way of uncovering things people don't want uncovered asterisk. As the judge moved on to other cases, Angela returned to her seat, her thoughts a whirlwind of questions. Why had her case been mishandled so thoroughly? Was it truly just incompetence, or was there something more deliberate at play? And if so, who stood to gain from it? The answers wouldn't come easily, she knew that much. But as she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the courtroom, she made a silent promise to herself. She would find the truth, no matter what it took. Angela walked out of the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the steps. She paused for a moment, her heels clicking softly on the stone, as she let the weight of the judge's words settle over her. An internal review of the DMV. That wasn't something anyone took lightly. It wasn't just about her fine anymore. This was about exposing something far more significant, and Angela knew she was now at the center of it. Her phone buzzed in her bag, breaking her thoughts. She reached for it, expecting a message from her assistant or a work-related email. Instead, it was an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering. Miss Carter, a voice said as soon as she picked up. It was deep, steady, and entirely unfamiliar. You don't know me, but I have information about your case. Can we meet? Angela froze, her mind racing. Who is this? She asked, her tone cautious but firm. That's not important right now, the man replied. What matters is that what's happening to you isn't an accident. There's a reason your case spiraled the way it did. I can explain everything, but not over the phone. Angela felt a chill run down her spine. Why should I trust you? Because if you don't, you're only going to see the tip of the iceberg, the man said. Meet me tonight, 7 p.m., at Jackson's Coffee on 5th Street. I'll bring proof. The line went dead before Angela could respond. She stood there for a moment, gripping her phone tightly, her heart pounding. She didn't like the idea of walking into a situation blind, especially one that felt this ominous. But something about the man's voice, the urgency, the certainty, made her feel like this wasn't a prank. That evening, Angela sat in her car across the street from the coffee shop, watching the door through the windshield. The rain had started to fall, droplets streaking the glass and blurring the neon glow of the sign. Her instincts told her this could be a trap, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of uncovering something important. Finally, she stepped out, pulling her coat tightly around her as she crossed the street. The coffee shop was nearly empty, just a barista wiping down the counter and a couple seated near the window. In the far corner, a man in a dark hoodie sat alone, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. You're braver than I thought, he said, as she sat down across from him. And you're vaguer than I expected. Angela shot back, her tone sharp. Who are you, and what do you know? The man slid a folder across the table, his eyes scanning the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. Angela hesitated before opening it, her breath catching as she skimmed the contents. There were emails, internal memos, even handwritten notes, documents that detailed not just errors in her case, but deliberate actions taken to escalate it. This, she said, her voice low but steady, this is a lot more than bureaucratic incompetence. What am I looking at? The man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You're looking at a targeted campaign. Your case was flagged because someone wanted it to be. The system didn't just fail you, it was weaponized against you. Angela's stomach turned as the words sank in. Why? Who would do this? And what did they have to gain? The man hesitated, his eyes flickering with something Angela couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or regret. That's where it gets complicated, he said. You've made a lot of waves in your career, Miss Carter. You've broken barriers, taken up space where people didn't want you. Some see that as a threat, and threats have to be neutralized. Angela's mind raced. She had faced resistance before, subtle slights, quiet exclusions, but this was something else entirely. You're saying this is personal. The man nodded. It always is. Angela felt a surge of anger, her hands clenching the edges of the folder. Why come forward now? Why not stay out of it? The man's expression darkened. Because I was part of it. I processed some of the paperwork, followed the orders. But when I saw how far it went, I couldn't stay silent. What's happening to you isn't right. And it's not just you. There are others. Angela's breath caught. Others. Dozens, the man said. Maybe more. Cases flagged, escalated, fines piled up until people couldn't fight back. You're just the first one with the resources and the platform to push back. If you do, you can blow this whole thing wide open. Angela sat back, her mind reeling. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about a system being used to target and exploit vulnerable people. The weight of it was overwhelming, but it also lit a fire in her. She couldn't walk away now, not when so much was at stake. Before she could respond, the man stood abruptly. I've already said too much, he said, his voice tense. Be careful, Miss Carter. They won't go down without a fight. And just like that, he was gone, leaving Angela alone at the table with the folder and 1,000 unanswered questions. As the rain continued to fall outside, he realized she was no longer just fighting for herself. This had become something much bigger, a battle she hadn't asked for, but one she knew she couldn't ignore. Angela sat in the coffee shop long after the man had left, the weight of the folder pressing down on her like an unseen hand. The documents were damning, each page a puzzle piece that hinted at something far more sinister than she had imagined. But it wasn't just the content that unnerved her. It was the man's fear. He wasn't just exposing corruption, he was running from it. The realization sent a shiver through her. Whoever was behind this wouldn't take kindly to being exposed, and if they had gone to such lengths to target her, what else were they capable of? As she drove home, her mind churned with possibilities. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, her every move scrutinized. The headlights of the car behind her seemed to linger too long, its presence a constant reminder of the invisible forces she was now up against. She made a few unexpected turns, her heart racing, but the car eventually peeled off onto another street. She told herself she was being paranoid, but deep down, she wasn't so sure. When Angela arrived home, she locked the door behind her and pulled the curtains shut. She set the folder on the dining table, staring at it as if it might reveal more secrets just by being in the room. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, you're getting close. Be careful who you trust, asterisk. Her stomach dropped. The message was cryptic but unmistakable. Someone knew what she was doing, and they wanted her to stop. Angela quickly deleted the message, her fingers trembling as she gripped the phone. She considered calling the police, but what could she say? That she had uncovered evidence of systemic corruption, and was now being warned off. Without proof, it would sound like a conspiracy theory at best. Instead, she dialed Daniel Hayes, the attorney who had approached her earlier that day. He picked up on the second ring, his voice calm and composed. "Miss Carter," he said, "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." "We need to talk," Angela said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "Something's come up." An hour later, Daniel was seated at her dining table, the folders spread out before him. He flipped through the pages, his expression growing darker with each new document. "This is bad," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "Really bad." "Tell me something I don't know," Angela replied, crossing her arms. "What I need to figure out is who's behind this and why." Daniel nodded, his fingers drumming against the table as he thought. "Whoever they are, they're organized. This isn't just about targeting you. It's about sending a message. To people like you, people who might challenge them." Angela frowned. "Challenge them how?" Daniel hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. "You're a corporate executive, Angela. You've made waves in your industry, pushed for diversity and inclusion, shaken up the status quo. That kind of visibility makes you a target for anyone who feels threatened by change." Angela leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "So this is about power, about keeping people like me in our place." "Partly," Daniel said, "but it's more than that. If what's in this folder is accurate, this is bigger than you. This is about exploiting the system to punish and control anyone who steps out of line." Before Angela could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door. Both she and Daniel froze, the tension in the room thickening instantly. "Were you expecting someone?" Daniel asked, his voice low. Angela shook her head, rising slowly from her chair. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood on the other side, his expression unreadable. "Miss Carter," he called, his voice muffled through the door. "I'm here to discuss your case. May I come in?" Angela's pulse quickened. She didn't recognize him, and something about his presence felt off. She stepped back from the door, motioning for Daniel to stay quiet. "Who sent you?" she called out. "I think you know," the man replied. "We have mutual interests, Miss Carter. It's in your best interest to hear me out." Angela's mind raced. Whoever this man was, he clearly knew more than he should. She glanced at Daniel, who shook his head, silently mouthing, "Don't open it." "I'm not interested," Angela said, her voice firm. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." The man sighed audibly, as if disappointed. "That's unfortunate," he said, "but I understand. You've had a long day. Perhaps we'll talk another time." Angela held her breath as his footsteps retreated. She waited until the sound of his car engine faded before turning back to Daniel. "What just happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. Daniel's expression was grim. "That was a warning," he said. "Whoever's behind this knows you're not backing down, and they're starting to feel threatened." Angela sank into a chair, her mind spinning. The stakes had just been raised, and the lines between friend and foe were becoming increasingly blurred. She knew one thing for certain. She couldn't afford to trust anyone, not until she uncovered the truth. Angela didn't sleep that night. Every creak of her house felt louder, every shadow stretching across her walls seemed to move. The weight of the folder sat heavy on her dining table, its contents screaming to be acted upon. She couldn't afford to wait anymore. The man at her door, the cryptic messages, and the looming pressure, it all pointed to one thing. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to back off until they'd silenced her. By morning, Angela had made her decision. She called Daniel and asked him to meet her at her office, a sleek building in the heart of downtown. From her window, she could see the city stirring to life, unaware of the storm brewing within its walls. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. This was for everyone who had been caught in the same web of manipulation and deceit. When Daniel arrived, he carried a laptop and an air of urgency. "I've been digging," he said, setting up his laptop on her desk. "And you're not going to believe this. The trail leads back to a consulting firm, a private contractor used by the DMV to manage fines and infractions. They're not just collecting fees, they're inflating them, targeting individuals flanked by an algorithm they claim is designed for efficiency. Angela's heart sank as she processed his words. "And who owns this consulting firm?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Daniel hesitated, then turned the laptop to face her. On the screen was a name she knew all too well. Logan Enterprises, a powerful conglomerate she had crossed paths with in the past. It was no secret that Logan Enterprises had a reputation for playing dirty, but to see their name tied to something this insidious made her blood boil. Angela leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "This isn't just about me," she said. "They're using their influence to exploit the system, profiting off the backs of people who can't fight back." Daniel nodded. "Exactly. And you're the perfect scapegoat. A high-profile target whose case could be dismissed as an anomaly if exposed too soon." Angela clenched her fists. "Then we need to expose it all. Not just my case, but the entire operation. If we can tie Logan Enterprises to this, they'll have no choice but to face the consequences." Daniel hesitated, his expression conflicted. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice low. "I found an internal memo, one that mentions a high-priority target. It's you, Angela. They didn't just pick your case at random. Someone specifically ordered this." Angela's stomach twisted. "Who?" Daniel pulled up another document, this one a series of emails. The sender's name made Angela's blood run cold. Mark Ellis, her former mentor, and a current board member at Logan Enterprises. Years ago, when Angela had first risen through the ranks, Mark had been a supporter, guiding her career and opening doors she hadn't known existed. But their relationship soured when Angela began pushing for reforms he didn't agree with, reforms that threatened the old guard's way of doing business. Angela felt a mix of betrayal and anger. "Mark," she whispered, the name like poison on her tongue. "He's the one pulling the strings." Daniel nodded. "It looks that way. He used his influence to target you, likely as a warning to anyone else thinking of shaking up the system." Angela stood, her resolve hardening. Then it's time to shake it up even more. Together, Angela and Daniel formulated a plan. They compiled all the evidence, the documents from the folder, the emails linking Logan Enterprises to the DMV, and even records of Mark's involvement. Angela reached out to trusted journalists, ensuring the story would have a platform too big to be silenced. The following week, Angela held a press conference. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions as she stepped up to the podium. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady as she laid everything bare: the corruption, the exploitation, and the deliberate targeting of vulnerable individuals. She didn't stop until every detail was out in the open, leaving no room for denial or deflection. As the press conference ended, Angela felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, but she knew this was only the beginning. Logan Enterprises would fight back, and Mark wouldn't go down quietly. Still, she had done what she set out to do. She had turned the spotlight on a system designed to operate in the shadows. That night, as Angela sat in her office, the phone rang. She hesitated before answering, half expecting another cryptic warning. Instead, a familiar voice spoke. "You've made a lot of enemies today," Mark Ellis said, his tone calm, but laced with menace. "I hope you're ready for what comes next." Angela's grip on the phone tightened. "I've faced worse," she said, "and I'm not afraid of you." Mark chuckled softly. "You should be," he said. "This isn't over." Angela hung up, her resolve unshaken. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she also knew she wasn't alone. With the truth on her side and a growing network of allies, she was ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for everyone fighting to make their voices heard in a system designed to silence them.